In the gilded heart of Monte Carlo, where the Mediterranean Sea kisses the shores of extreme wealth, a tragedy unfolded that shook the global banking world to its core. On the morning of December 3, 1999, black smoke billowed from the windows of one of the most exclusive addresses in the Principality. This was not just any residence, but the fortress-like penthouse of Edmond Safra, a man who had spent his entire life building walls of security around himself. The irony was palpable as the man who feared assassination and kidnapping above all else found himself trapped in his own sanctuary, while flames consumed the opulent rooms around him. Firefighters struggled against the blaze, while rumors instantly began to circulate through the streets of Monaco about Russian mobs and professional hitmen. Edmond Safra was a figure who commanded immense respect and fear, in equal measure within the secretive world of international finance. He was a man who understood the value of discretion and the power of silence, having built an empire that spanned continents and decades. His death was not merely the passing of a wealthy individual, but the violent end of an era for private banking. The circumstances surrounding his demise were so bizarre and contradictory that they immediately sparked a frenzy of speculation. How could a man protected by a private army of former soldiers and the most advanced security systems money could die in such a chaotic and seemingly preventable manner inside his own home? To understand the magnitude of this event, one must first understand the man himself and the colossal fortune he amassed. Edmond Safra was born into a family of Jewish bankers in Beirut, Lebanon, where the art of handling money was passed down through generations like a sacred trust. He was a prodigy who understood the intricacies of gold and currency trade before he was even a teenager. By the time he was an adult, he had established himself as a financial wizard capable of navigating the treacherous waters of global economics with uncanny precision. His journey took him from the bustling markets of the Middle East to the boardrooms of Brazil, and finally, to the skyscrapers of New York City and the palaces of Europe. The Safra name became synonymous with stability and trust in an industry often plagued by volatility and scandal. Edmond founded the Republic National Bank of New York and grew it into a powerhouse that catered to the ultra-wealthy. He was known for his conservative banking practices and his obsession with protecting the assets of his clients. However, this obsession with protection extended far beyond his business dealings and seeped deep into his personal life. Edmond Safra lived in a constant state of high alert, convinced that dark forces were conspiring to steal his wealth or take his life. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded, given the dangerous world he inhabited, but it would ultimately play a tragic role in his death. By the late 1990s, Edmond Safra was suffering from Parkinson's disease, which had left him physically frail and dependent on a team of nurses and caregivers. He had retreated to his magnificent penthouse in Monaco, a duplex apartment that sat atop the La Belle Époque building overlooking the harbor. This residence was designed to be impregnable with bulletproof, glass-reinforced steel doors and a panic room that could withstand a siege. It was here in this golden cage that Edmond planned to live out his remaining years in peace, surrounded by his art collection and his devoted wife Lily. But the fortress he had built to keep the world out would soon become a trap. The security apparatus surrounding Edmond Safra was legendary and rivaled that of many heads of state. He employed a rotating team of guards, many of whom were veterans of the Israeli Mossad or elite military units. These men were trained to react to any threat with lethal force, and they monitored the penthouse 24 hours a day. Cameras covered every angle of the property and strict protocols governed who could enter and leave. It seemed impossible that an intruder could breach such defenses without triggering an immediate and overwhelming response. Yet on that fateful December morning, The system failed in a way that no one could have predicted. The events of December 3rd began in the early hours of the morning, while the city of Monte Carlo was still asleep. Inside the penthouse, Edmond Safra was resting in his bedroom, attended by his night nurse Vivian Torrent. Also present in the apartment was another nurse named Ted Maher, an American, who had only been working for the Safra family for a few months. Ted Maher was a former Green Beret, or so he claimed, and he had been hired to provide medical care and security for the ailing banker. However, beneath his professional exterior lay a turbulent mind filled with resentment and a desperate need for recognition. At approximately 5 a.m, Ted Maher staggered into the nursing station, bleeding profusely from stab wounds to his abdomen and thigh. He claimed that 2 masked intruders had broken into the penthouse and attacked him. According to his frantic account, he had fought them off bravely, but they were still inside the apartment intent on harming Edmond Safra. This terrifying report set off a chain reaction of panic and confusion. Maher managed to alert the other staff members, and the police were summoned immediately. The narrative of a violent home invasion fit perfectly with Safra's greatest fears and the long-standing rumors of enemies seeking his destruction. As the alarm was raised, Edmond Safra and Vivian Torrent did exactly what they had been trained to do in such a situation. They retreated into the bathroom attached to Safra's bedroom, which doubled as a reinforced safe room. They locked the heavy steel door behind them and waited for help to arrive. Inside that small windowless space, they were cut off from the rest of the apartment and the unfolding chaos outside. They had a telephone, but they were terrified that the intruders were waiting just on the other side of the door, ready to kill them if they emerged. They believed they were safe inside their bunker, but a new and deadlier threat was about to emerge. While Safra and Torrent huddled in the bathroom, a fire broke out in the nursing station nearby. The flames spread rapidly, fed by the oxygen in the spacious apartment and the flammable materials within. Thick toxic smoke began to fill the penthouse, obscuring vision and making it impossible to breathe. The fire alarm system blared, adding to the cacophony of sirens approaching from the streets below. The supposed intruders were nowhere to be seen, but the fire was a very real and immediate danger. The smoke began to seep under the door of the safe room, turning the sanctuary into a gas chamber. The police and firefighters arrived at the La Belle Epoque building within minutes, but they were met with a confusing and chaotic scene. Ted Maher, who was being treated for his wounds, continued to insist that armed men were inside the penthouse. This information caused the police to hesitate. They established a perimeter and treated the situation as a hostage crisis rather than a simple fire. They were afraid to storm the apartment for fear of provoking a shootout with the phantom attackers. This delay would prove to be catastrophic for the 2 people trapped inside the bathroom. Valuable time ticked away as the authorities strategized and waited for backup. Meanwhile, the fire raged out of control, consuming the priceless art and furniture that filled the penthouse. Inside the bathroom, Edmond Safra and Vivian Torrent were frantically calling for help on a mobile phone. They spoke to family members and staff pleading for rescue as the air quality deteriorated. Safra was terrified that the assassins were waiting to shoot him, and he refused to unlock the door despite the pleas of the emergency operators. His paranoia, which had kept him safe for so long, was now sealing his fate. The firefighters eventually realized that the fire was the primary threat and pushed their way into the building. They battled the intense heat and smoke to reach the upper floors, but the layout of the penthouse and the security measures made their progress slow and difficult. By the time they reached the bedroom suite, the fire had been largely extinguished, but the damage had been done. They found the armored door to the bathroom locked from the inside. They had to use special equipment to breach the barrier, and when they finally swung the door open, a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Edmond Safra and Vivian Torrent were found dead on the floor of the bathroom. They had not been shot or stabbed by assassins. They had suffocated from smoke inhalation. The billionaire who could afford anything in the world had died for lack of fresh air. His body was unmarked save for the soot that covered him. Vivian Torrent lay beside him, a loyal caregiver who had stayed by his side until the very end. The tragedy was compounded by the realization that if they had simply opened the door earlier, they might have been saved. The walls that were meant to protect them had become their tomb. As the news of Safra's death spread, the initial theory of a Russian mafia hit gained traction in the media. It seemed like the only logical explanation for such a high-profile death. Edmond Safra had been involved in exposing money laundering operations in Russia, and many believed he had a target on his back. The story of the masked intruders provided by Ted Maher fit this narrative perfectly. The world watched in fascination as the details of the supposed assassination plot emerged. However, investigators on the ground in Monaco were already beginning to find holes in Maher's story. Detectives examining the scene found no evidence of forced entry. The complex security system showed no record of anyone entering the apartment at the time Maher claimed the attack occurred. Furthermore, the surveillance cameras had not captured any masked men fleeing the building. The knife used to stab Maher was found at the scene, and it belonged to the Safra household. Most damning of all was the nature of Maher's wounds. Forensic experts concluded that the stab wounds were tentative and superficial, consistent with self-inflicted injuries rather than a life-and-death struggle. The focus of the investigation shifted rapidly from a search for external assassins to the man who claimed to be the hero. Ted Maher was brought in for questioning, and his story began to crumble under scrutiny. He was an unstable individual with a history of financial troubles and a strained marriage. He had grown resentful of the other nurses who he felt were treated better than him. He wanted to prove his worth to Edmond Safra and secure his position within the inner circle. The truth that emerged was far stranger and more pathetic than any international conspiracy. Under intense interrogation, Ted Maher confessed to a shocking reality. There were no intruders. There were no assassins. He had staged the entire attack himself. In a twisted attempt to ingratiate himself with his employer, he had stabbed himself and started a small fire in a wastebasket. His plan was to raise the alarm, extinguish the fire, and present himself as the savior who had fought off the attackers. He believed that Safra would be so grateful that he would reward Maher with money and status. It was a delusion born of desperation and narcissism. Maher's plan went horribly wrong from the very beginning. The fire he started in the wastebasket did not stay small. It caught onto the curtains and quickly engulfed the room. The smoke spread faster than he anticipated, and the chaos he unleashed spiraled out of his control. In his panic, he lost his nerve and focused on his own injuries, leaving Safra and Torrent to their fate. He never intended to kill them, but his reckless actions had set in motion a sequence of events that led directly to their deaths. The hero fantasy had turned into a double homicide. The confession of Ted Maher sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was hard to believe that one of the wealthiest and most protected men in the world had been killed, not by a sophisticated criminal organization, but by a disgruntled employee with a box of matches. The banality of the crime stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the victim. It was a senseless waste of life, driven by petty jealousy and incompetence. The Monaco police formally charged Ted Maher with arson causing death, and the stage was set for a dramatic trial. Despite the confession, conspiracy theories continued to swirl. Many people refused to believe that a simple nurse could have orchestrated such a disaster on his own. They pointed to the fact that Safra's security team seemed oddly absent during the critical moments. Questions were raised about why the firefighters took so long to breach the bathroom door. Some even speculated that Maher was a patsy who had been manipulated by more powerful forces to eliminate Safra. These theories persisted because the truth seemed too simple for such a complex man. The legal proceedings against Ted Maher were lengthy and complex. He attempted to retract his confession, claiming that he had been coerced by the Monaco police. His defense team tried to paint him as a victim of a corrupt system. However, the physical evidence and the inconsistencies in his original story were overwhelming. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who was dangerous and delusional, a man who was willing to risk the lives of others to satisfy his own ego. The trial offered a glimpse into the strange and isolated world of the Safra household. During the trial, details about the night of the fire were examined in minute detail. The court heard how Safra's fear kept him locked in the bathroom, even as the smoke thickened. Witnesses testified to the confusion of the police and the breakdown in communication. It became clear that a perfect storm of paranoia, errors, and malice had combined to cause the tragedy. Ted Maher sat in the dock, a broken man, far removed from the hero he had aspired to be. The verdict was never really in doubt, but the sentence would determine his future. In 2002, Ted Maher was convicted of arson resulting in death and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The sentence was seen by some as lenient given the magnitude of the loss, but the court took into account that he had not intended to kill. He served his time in a Monaco prison before being released and deported back to the United States. He has since maintained his innocence in various interviews, often changing his story and blaming others for the events of that night. But for the Safra family and the world at large, he remains the man who burned down the bank. The death of Edmond Safra left a void in the banking world that was difficult to fill. His empire was sold shortly after his death, and the Republic National Bank was absorbed by HSBC. His philanthropic legacy, however, continued through the Edmond J. Safra Foundation, which supports causes in education, science, and medicine around the globe. His wife, Lily Safra, carried on his work and preserved his memory, ensuring that his name would be associated with generosity rather than just tragedy. But the shadow of the fire in Monte Carlo always loomed large. The penthouse at La Belle Epoque was eventually renovated and sold for a record-breaking sum, becoming one of the most expensive apartments in history. The physical scars of the fire were erased, but the memory of what happened there remained. It stands as a monument to the fragility of life and the futility of material wealth in the face of death. No amount of gold or marble could protect Edmond Safra from the demons of one-man mind. The building remains a landmark in Monaco, a silent witness to a night of horror. Looking back at the case, it serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of paranoia. Edmond Safra's fear of the outside world led him to create a fortress that ultimately trapped him. If he had not been so conditioned to fear assassination, he might have opened the door and fled the fire. His security protocols, which were designed to save him, became the very mechanism of his destruction. It is a tragic paradox that continues to fascinate criminologists and psychologists alike. The story of Edmond Safra is also a cautionary tale about the people we trust. Ted Maher was vetted and hired to protect the most intimate aspects of Safra life. He was given access to the inner sanctum and entrusted with the physical well-being of a billionaire. Yet he was the one who brought the danger inside. It highlights the difficulty of truly knowing the intentions of those around us, especially when vast sums of money and power are involved. The betrayal of trust was as lethal as the smoke. Even decades later, the mystery of Edmond Safra's death retains a certain allure. Was Ted Maher truly acting alone, or was he a pawn in a larger game? While the evidence points to the former, the sheer scale of Safra's influence makes it tempting to believe in grander conspiracies. The intersection of high finance, global politics, and personal madness creates a narrative that is hard to resist. It is a story that has all the elements of a classic tragedy played out on the world stage. As we reflect on this case, we are left with the image of a man who had everything yet died with nothing but fear in a dark room. The billions in the bank could not buy him another breath of air. The death of Edmond Safra is a stark memento mori, a reminder that death comes for us all regardless of our station. It is a mystery not of who did it, but of how the human mind can create such catastrophe. The smoke has cleared over Monte Carlo, but the questions linger in the silence. The legacy of Edmond Safra is complex, defined by his brilliance as a banker and the horror of his death. He was a man who shaped the modern financial world, and his influence is still felt today. But he will always be remembered as the billionaire who died in a bunker of his own making. The tragedy serves as a final dark chapter in a life that was anything but ordinary. It is a story of ambition, fear, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Ultimately, the death of Edmond Safra forces us to confront the limits of control. We can build walls and hire guards, but we cannot eliminate risk entirely. The greatest threats often come from within, from the people we rely on, or from our own anxieties. The fire in Monaco was a convergence of all these factors, a perfect disaster that no security system could prevent. It remains one of the most compelling and tragic true crime stories of the 20th century. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean and the lights of Monte Carlo twinkle in the twilight, the La Belle Époque building stands tall against the sky. It is a symbol of luxury and power, but for those who know the story, it is also a tomb. The ghost of Edmond Safra seems to haunt the narrative of the city, a reminder that even in paradise, darkness can find a way in. The mystery may be officially solved, but the unease it generates will never truly fade away. We are left to wonder what Edmond Safra was thinking in those final moments, as he waited for a rescue that would come too late. Did he realize that his fears had manifested in the worst possible way? Did he know that the threat was not a team of assassins, but a single delusional man? The silence of the safe room holds those secrets forever. And so the story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper lost in the smoke of history.